Okay, it's 1 o'clock and we are ready to start our webinar. I want to say thank you to everybody who took the time to join us today. We see all of you on and greatly appreciate that. A few quick things before we get going. We are going to automatically mute everybody, so you should not have control as a participant of your microphones. We mute everyone, so a couple reasons. The presenters can keep their train of thought and keep on talking. It's very difficult to talk to a computer. Also, a lot of people are home with their kids, and so we have kid background noise, dog background noise, whatever else background noise, and we are recording this session, so we want to minimize that as much as possible. Quickly about questions, as you can see, there is a chat box on the side. We ask that if you have a question for any of our presenters, that you type your question into the text box on the side, and Amanda will facilitate the questions to the presenters at the end. So we won't lose your questions. Feel free to type those in whenever you think of them, and we will try to get to them at the end of this session. If we do not get to your question for some reason, we will reply to you via email. If you have any other questions that you think of after the webinar has ended, please feel free to reach out to us. We will make sure we get you the best possible answer we can to your questions. So, introducing our guest speakers. First of all, my name is Melissa McCart. I'm the director of our Oregon TBI teams here in Oregon, and I am part of the Center on Brain Injury Research and Training. This is part of our webinar series. So we have invited Drs. Julie Haarbauer-Krupa and Dr. Ann Glang to join us today and present. They are going to be presenting on the report to Congress and the management of TBI in children. So we are very happy they're both joining us today. Ann Glang is the director of the Center on Brain Injury Research and Training, and she has directed or co-directed over 30 federally funded research projects on TBI. And Ann is the co-author of the report to Congress with Julie. I'm sure she'll tell you more about herself. She has quite a list of achievements, so we're happy Ann joined us today. And Dr. Julie Haarbauer-Krupa is a senior health scientist at the Center for Disease Control with a research focus on traumatic brain injury. She's the project lead on the report to Congress and the management of TBI in children, and on the Return to School project. Julie has over 100 publications and presentations on TBI and works on many projects benefiting children with brain injuries. So we're very honored both of them have decided to present this today. And on that note, I am going to let them begin presenting. Thank you, Julie and Ann.
Oh, and thank you very much, Melissa. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. We really look forward to your thoughts and questions, so please feel free to post them in the chat. So I'm going to talk today about the report to Congress on the management of traumatic brain injury in children, but I'm first going to start out by talking about pediatric injuries and epidemiology, because we know in children, injuries occur across the entire pediatric lifespan, from babies to those just graduating from high school. I've heard many stories of teens who have a brain injury the day of graduation, which is not good to hear, but we're going to be talking a little bit about the lifespan and what that means. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the epidemiology, because this really supports a lot of our efforts. So on our webpage, which you see at the bottom, we put a surveillance report up, and this is the current one that looks at 2014 data. Shortly, there will be a new one updating to 2016 data. But we see how many occurred in children, 2.87 million. And this is based on emergency department visits, hospitalizations, and deaths. So This surveillance report is available in its entirety on our website. You're welcome to download it, but really it really covers emergency department visits. So these are kids that go to the emergency department for care. And here's our trends, because fortunately, hospitalizations and deaths have stayed about the same or lowered a little bit. But what we're seeing is emergency department visits for TBI continue to rise overall. And based on emergency department visits, these are the 3 top age groups who had the highest number of emergency department visits. It used to be that preschool children were on top, but over the last few years, individuals age 65 and older now comprise the highest rate of emergency department visits, followed by the youngest children, 0 to 4 years, by fall. So both older adults and young children primarily visit the ED for a TBI based on falls. And in ages to 15 to 24 years, that's our 3rd group. And you know what? That's when kids are starting to drive and getting out in the world. So that, I think, accounts for a lot of those TBIs. But interestingly, back a few years ago, we worked with Children's Healthcare Philadelphia, who has a large integrated electronic health record. So they not only have emergency department visits, they have primary care, specialty clinics like concussion clinics, rehab clinics, and who was admitted. And from this, we learned that for concussion or mild TBI, most children were seeing their primary care physician, 82%. So that was an eye-opener, because those children are not included in the emergency department statistics. And that made us think about, how are we going to do this better? We also looked at mechanism of injury across the pediatric lifespan in this data. In children older than 5 years, contributed to the majority of the concussion, and about 30% of these were non-sports and recreational related. So what we learned from this is sports-related concussions, as you can see, really start to increase around age 6 or 7 and really increase 9, 10, and older into the teen years. And if you look at the literature on when children enter organized sports, that really aligns with when they're starting to enter organized sports, which I think accounts for a lot of those sports-related injuries. We also produced something called an MMWR, which is a CDC report on our website, specifically on children who go to the emergency departments for sports and recreation-related TBI. So we saw that contact sports, not surprising, contributed to half of these sports and recreation TBI visits. And the activities with the highest number of TBI visits included football, bicycling, basketball, playground activities, especially for younger children, and soccer. So this specifically tells about sports and recreational injuries in children. And I was interested in something called the National Survey of Children's Health. And what this is, it's a national survey of all parents that includes questions about not only TBI, but what the children, other health conditions they have, insurance. It has a lot of questions. So we looked at this, and we looked at how they ask a brain injury question. Has your child ever experienced a brain injury or concussion based on this era of data? But what's interesting is all the health conditions we saw that were associated with a history of TBI. So parents are asked if they were ever told by a healthcare provider if their child had a brain injury or concussion. And then they were also asked, does your child have these health conditions? So parents who said yes to that question had a higher rate of some of these health conditions compared to those who said no. And interestingly, this is one of the first papers that looked at speech and language problems, and many of you in the schools know that that's part of a brain injury sequela, but it's not really talked about much, but it is here. And I don't think any of these health conditions are surprising. The other thing that's really influenced care for children is the return to play laws that are now in 50 states. All of these laws include three components of education, removal from play, and return to play. Some of them, only about 8 or 9 states have a law tied with the return to play about return to school. And we'll talk a little more about, Anne will talk more about what's going on in school. But this has really influenced care for children, and we see, especially in some states, that these laws seem to be making parents more aware of the need to seek medical care. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about taking care of children with TBI. And here's our report to Congress, which is on our website, cdc.gov, under TBI. And I thank Anne Glang very much for her great contributions to this report, and Dr. Brad Kowalski, who's a physical medicine and rehab physician, and also our traumatic brain injury team lead, Dr. Matt Briding. Excuse me. Everyone gave substantial contributions to this report. Excuse me. But prior to writing this report, I led a paper that looked at service delivery, not just in the healthcare system and not just in the educational system, but the continuum that the parents and children experience, because it is a continuum. So they may see the healthcare setting for their diagnosis, but then they go back to school. And as I said when I started at CDC, kids are in the healthcare system for TBI about 5 minutes. They're in school for the rest of their lives. So it's really important to talk about both settings. And frankly, one of the main gaps, which we'll talk about further in the report to Congress, is the communication between healthcare settings and schools and how there's often a gap there. So we were asked to write this report to Congress to originally identify these gaps in healthcare, school, and community services, and highlight potential strategies and actionable recommendation to improve TBI care for children. And this little postcard that you see, those are the 3 words that we decided to come out of this. Really, what we want people to do is recognize TBI in children, monitor children who've had a TBI, and take care of those who need care. And this tells a little bit about how this project got started, because the Traumatic Brain Injury Act of 2014 actually mandated us to conduct this report to Congress in collaboration with NIH. And we're so thrilled. We engaged a group of about 60 experts from various disciplines to provide feedback to us on the report, including on the original outline, the first draft, and the final draft. And so we gained knowledge from people in the field, including educators, parents, physicians, public policy people, advocacy groups in this report, and their feedback was excellent. It was released in March of 2018. So on first 2 areas we covered, the medical management and the school management. Well, we talked about the burden and the epidemiology too, of course. It's a CDC report. But I'm going to cover the medical management, and then Anne will be talking about school-based management that's covered in the report. So you see there's a brain injury severity continuum. There's concussions and mild TBI. There's something called complicated mild to moderate. Complicated mild means that behaviorally you show symptoms of a mild TBI, but you have imaging findings, like a bleed or a blood clot. And then moderate to severe TBI. That's the continuum of severity that we currently see. So some health outcomes of mild TBI, most children who experience of mild TBI have a good recovery, at least from what we know about the current literature. A large percentage of children recover without lasting sequela. But there are 1/3 to 2/3 that have persistent symptoms. And changes of emotion, sleep difficulties, but also understanding children's pre-existing health conditions is also important to their recovery prognosis. Whereas moderate to severe TBI, children who experience this really have a real range of acute medical issues. They may have autonomic dysfunction. They may be in a coma. They may have hydrocephalus. This lists all the issues that, in addition to getting hit in the head, that it can trigger, like seizures. We know that with moderate to severe traumatic brain injuries, children do better if they're transferred to a pediatric trauma center that knows how to address the needs of children. However, these trauma centers aren't everywhere. They tend to be in large university settings. And there's real variability in access to rehabilitation services across the country. So many of you as educators may know of children who came from rehab, but that's really, we estimated in the report based on a national study, only about 4% go into rehab of hospitalized children. Many children don't have health care insurance to cover it. Sometimes parents want them to come home. So there's different reasons why children don't go to rehab. And also for moderate to severe TBI, there is long-term documentation of neurocognitive and behavioral problems over time. There have been some longitudinal studies that have primarily studied moderate to severe TBI. There's still small number studies, but we do know that children are at great risk to have issues in the long term. So I like this diagram because it shows you the complex health system that children with moderate to severe or even mild TBI go through. So they can be seen even with mild, as I mentioned, at primary care, urgent care, which is called ambulatory surgery centers here. Children with more moderate to severe TBI are often hospitalized, seen by specialists, and they may go to places, there's 4 places they could go to when they're done, when they've recovered enough to be stable. Inpatient or outpatient rehab, skilled nursing facilities, and those are for children who are pretty severe and potentially still remaining in a coma. They could go home to be cared for, or they could go to hospice. So I just want to finish up with this by saying this is something that happens. It gives you an idea of the complexity of medical care for this population. And I recently have talked to many school nurses, but one of them said to me, you know, for diabetes, we see an endocrinologist, and they really are the ones we know, they know diabetes. With traumatic brain injury, they may see a variety of specialists, from primary care pediatricians to neurologists to sports medicine physicians and physical medicine and rehab physicians. So there's such a variety of disciplines who see these children that it's often hard to keep the communication consistent over all disciplines. And in an effort to do this, CDC started this work group before we started on the report to Congress. It took them 3 or 4 years to review all the literature to develop pediatric mild TBI guidelines. So the report came out in March. These came out in September. And these are consensus-based guidelines, which is based on evidence-based. So prior to this, there were consensus-based guidelines. You may be aware of these from the Berlin conferences on sports concussion, but this is truly an evidence-based guideline, and it summarizes 25 years of scientific research. It covers all causes of pediatric mild TBI, not just sports, and it includes guidance across physician disciplines and settings. And here's a snapshot of the clinical recommendations, because there were 5 practice-changing recommendations that were recommended. One is no routine imaging of patients with suspected TBI for diagnostic purposes. And that means you don't use imaging in children to diagnose it, because imaging can be puts children at risk for later issues. But if a physician suspects they have a blood clot or some kind of internal injury, they will do imaging. It's not that they don't, but it's not to be done automatically. Use validated age-appropriate symptom scales for children. So there's scales currently for high school, middle school, and some elementary school, but recent research is showing us that children under age 5 can show different symptoms, and I know several folks are in the process of developing a scale for that age group, but it's really important to use age-appropriate symptom scales. Assess evidence-based risk factors for prolonged recovery, such as what is the child's medical history? Do they have other health conditions? This one's particularly important. Provide patients with instructions on return to activity, including school, customized to their symptoms, and also counsel them to return gradually to non-sports activities. And to get this information into practice, these are tools on our website for healthcare providers. You can see there's a checklist for them to use related to the guidelines to keep up with continuity, discharge instructions for parents, and also recovery tips for parents are on this website. But we also have put out diagnostic recommendations, prognostic recommendations, and management and treatment guidelines, including physician-based modules of training. And one thing I wanted to say to you, I'm sorry it's not on here, but we do have return to school discharge instructions that are on our website that we have available for physicians that list the symptoms of concussion and how much rest they need. So you can see that on our website as well. So I want to talk about some take-home points about medical management. We need consistent guideline implementation across healthcare providers. That's especially important for mild TBI. The other issue is in adults, traumatic brain injury is called a chronic disease in adults. There's been several papers about that. That's not true for children. It hasn't necessarily been recognized. There aren't enough studies to say what is a chronic disease in children. Children also have frequently unmet needs after hospital discharge. This has been documented in multiple studies, including one by Molly Fuentes, which was a few years ago, that mentioned that one of the unmet needs is school services, speech and language, and things that work on cognition related to learning. In children who have mild brain injury, especially motor and balance problems may be more subtle, which is really important for them, especially if they're in organized sports, to get a good evaluation of their skills prior to returning to play. There's not a clear definition of recovery, how long it takes, what is recovery, and how to determine it objectively. Silent problems occur in complex settings and return to the real world. So a child may recover physically, and this is very common in children, but they aren't paying attention or thinking the same, and that's not always observable. And it's really important to look at their pre-injury health and behavior, because that contributes to their post-injury recovery. And also consistent and regular assessments are very important to make sure that kids are doing well after their injury. So this is an area that needs some work. And as Anne Glang said in her study, in 2014, communication between medical systems and schools is better if children are enrolled in inpatient rehabilitation, because they often have educators or staff, case management staff, to help guide that. Medical records are not always accessible by the school, and especially if it's mild, it might not be even reported to the school. So we need to work on this link. And following an injury, you know, a traumatic brain injury is an unexpected event that parents don't anticipate, and they may or may not get education about how this can affect their school performance at the time of diagnosis. They may learn how it affects their child's health, development, and school performance when the child returns to school. And so that's why educators are such key roles in this, because parents may be returning and first noticing what this means for their child. We mentioned in the report about problem-solving behavior or therapy that Sherry Wade has done, has been helpful. It's a computer-based online problem-solving. That's what we've seen so far, but there's not a lot of evidence yet about what best supports families and parents. And the other thing that happens is children can go back to school, but what are they doing with their activities? Because the return to play legislation primarily focuses on organized sports in high school students. Organized sports. And as we saw in that diagram about mechanism of injury, children have so many different activities. And so it's in addition to organized sports, especially young children who may not be engaging in organized sports yet. There's a lack of universal progression for all sports and variability in how return to play guidelines are interpreted and implemented across the country. One of the things we also noticed is return to driving protocols are lacking. So teens that have just gotten their license and then have a head injury, there's nothing clear about how to determine whether they can return to drive. And also return to activity guidelines for younger children is lacking. And also for children who may have had a non-sports related concussion in elementary school, they do go back to things like recess, not research, and gym class when they go to school, and we don't have real clear activity guidelines for that across the country. So these are some of the issues I want to raise about the medical aspects, the family aspects, and return to play and activity. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Glang, who will be talking about educational services.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Julie, also for involving me in writing this report. And I want to just point out, I have been working in this field, as has Julie, for a very long time. And most of the research and most of the literature really comes from the medical side. A lot of studies have been done about medical management and about sort of the ongoing medical issues, certainly going into cognition and behavior as well. But in terms of really the school issue, there hasn't been a lot of focus on that. And I think what Julie did in this opportunity with the report to Congress was she said, you know, as she just said, children spend 5 minutes in the hospital. They spend the rest of their lives in the school and community. And so it was because of her thinking and advocacy that this report to Congress doesn't just focus on medical issues. And I think that's what is so exciting and presents such a nice opportunity for really all of us to say, hey, here's this document mandated by Congress that says kids have these real issues in both medical and educational realms of their lives. And so I wanted to thank Julie for that, and just also to say about this report and this presentation, we are doing this very high level. You know, in 45 minutes, we certainly can't go into depth on many topics, but I want to encourage you all to please be in touch with follow-up questions. Our contact information is going to be on the slides, and we both welcome that. We, you know, all of us have a lot of extra time now, and really look forward to hearing from you about your thoughts and questions. Okay, Julie's going to be my Vanna White. So thank you, Julie. So we know from years of research, which we reviewed for the report to Congress, that there is a lot of evidence documenting the negative effects of brain injury across the severity of injury spectrum. And I think it's important to point out, most of us understand there's a real difference between severity of injury and severity of disability. They're not necessarily correlated. That is, you can have a moderate injury and a child can actually have a very low level of disability following that, and vice versa. So I like to think as a school person, in terms of disability disability severity rather than in terms of injury severity. And last thing as a preamble that I should point out is that my background is in special education. Julie's background is in speech language pathology. And both of us have a fair amount of experience working with kids and families. So that's another thing I think that is refreshing about this report, that we bring that lens in its interpretation. Okay. So in terms of educational outcomes, I just want to review some things. So we know that kids with moderate to severe TBI do have significant cognitive, behavioral, and social challenges when they go back to school. They don't do as well grade-wise. They get held back more often. They more frequently need special education. And we've known that for some time, probably since the 90s, we've had some pretty good evidence to that effect, and it hasn't unfortunately changed much. What we didn't have as much information about was those kids with milder injuries. And Fred Rivara and his group, as well as Linda Ewing-Cobbs and her colleague, Mary Prasad, have done some really nice work looking at those kids with less severe injuries. And Fred Rivara's study followed a large sample of children under 18 and found that 1 year later, about 14% of those kids needed support at school. This is important because of the numbers, and Julie just reviewed them, the numbers of kids with mild brain injuries. 14% of millions of kids is still a lot of kids. And also, as Julie said, a lot of those kids are going unnoticed, and those of you who are working in schools know that. But it's important, I think, for us to recognize that we do have kids with mild TBI who are struggling at school, and there are a lot of them. The other thing that Melissa and I have talked a lot about this study by Mary Prasad, and we can give you citations for all of these, but they looked at kids over a much longer period. I think it was 6 years. And they showed that kids with moderate to mild complicated and moderate TBI actually needed more support over time. So that 6 years out, they were needing to access special education and other formalized supports in school at higher rates than they were when they first returned to school following their injury. So lots of implications for this. First and foremost being we need to be monitoring these children. And secondly, we need to be remembering that they had a brain injury. But I think those two studies in particular were really illustrative of what's going on in schools and how we are probably missing kids. Okay. One thing we know little about is how kids do once they leave high school. Do they graduate? Do they have jobs? And on the next slide, you'll see these kids do have lower rates of enrollment in post-secondary education. They're not going to college and getting training after they graduate. They're doing that, but at much lower rates than kids with other disabilities. So speech language impairments, autism, learning disabilities, and other special ed categories, kids in those categories. The kids with brain injury are less likely to be going to college. They also are less likely to have good jobs. So they tend to be working in poorly paying jobs. We saw at age 25 in this study that was listed there, that there was a real gap between those who had sustained a moderate to severe brain injury and kids who hadn't. So they tended to be working very entry-level, low-skilled jobs, whereas their peers at age 25 were working higher paid, skilled positions. And this is an older study, 2004, but I don't think we are seeing much different in new things that are coming out, and also there aren't many new studies coming out. The other finding that we know about in terms of long-term outcomes is that there are a couple of studies showing that kids who sustain an injury as a child are more likely to be incarcerated, more likely to engage in criminal behavior. Okay. So what is available to kids with TBI that could mitigate some of these problems and potentially improve outcomes? Because we want to talk about both the gaps as well as some solutions in this report. And most of you on the call are probably working in schools, and you know that special education is available, that early intervention if you're under age 5, special education if you're 5 to 21, you can access those services. The eligibility criteria vary across states, but those services typically will include, once you get them, will include specially designed instruction, things like behavioral interventions, maybe consultation with occupational therapy or physical therapy, speech language. And there's, for another day and another topic, another webinar, there's a fair amount of information showing, fair amount of evidence showing that kids with brain injuries are not getting hooked up at the rates that they probably should be with these special education services, especially those young kids. Also, 504, Section 504, so for kids with less significant needs, those services can really improve access to education. So, for example, physical modifications to the school, offering audiobooks, modifying a child's schedule, reducing their workload. These are things that a child can get access to. And then finally on this slide, transition services. So starting at age 16, a child can work with their team to create goals for their post-school plans and specific steps for getting there. In each of these cases, for all of these federally mandated supports, these are all, really nicely crafted legislation, and in theory should be meeting the needs of these kids. But for lots of reasons, I'm going to talk about a few more of those coming up, but kids aren't getting as well hooked up as they should be. And these programs are all implemented, of course, with huge variability across our country. Okay. Just quickly, there are also some state-based services and supports offered by most states. So things like school-based health services, so a student can see a school nurse or an aide right at school and get some support for medical kinds of issues that are related to their brain injury. On a larger scale across the country, we have parent training and information centers. So parents can get connected with those, and they have some nice web-based materials and good websites in each state. Some states have more than one of these. There's also state advocacy groups, so the Brain Injury Association and the U.S. Brain Injury Alliance, that offer in almost every state. There's a state chapter that will offer support groups, resources, and help for families. And then there are some federal TBI grants to states, and these are probably a little harder to access, but there's some federal dollars that go directly to states to increase access to services for folks with TBI. And then some states do have TBI trust funds where they allocate some percentage, for example, of moving violations, the fees paid towards those to provide TBI services. Okay. Talk a little bit more about the gaps in educational services. I've kind of touched on that, but in spite of those programs that I just mentioned, as well as the federally mandated special education, 504, transition, and so on services, there are some real gaps in accessing those services. So on a kind of a high level, I think Julie mentioned education for families, that when their child leaves the hospital, often they leave not really understanding what the effects of TBI could be once their child goes back to school. And so they're not often in the best position to advocate because of that. And then secondly, often when families do go back to school, they encounter a lack of understanding about TBI, and they find out, or they realize that they're the ones who needs to provide the information to school. So this slide is about a small study that we conducted in 2008 in the Pacific Northwest, and there were 56 children that were hospitalized overnight. And we asked their families, was there communication between the hospital and school And families said only about 39% of the time. So most of the time, there was no communication between the medical facility and the school facility, or it was maybe unclear. And that, I don't think that has improved since 2008, unfortunately, that even if a child spends the night in the hospital, there is not necessarily a solid linkage between the two systems. And Julie was just telling me yesterday, I believe, that they're looking at that same variable, hospital school communication, for kids with concussion or milder injuries, and seeing the same kinds of patterns, that there's still not good linkage. And that, as she just pointed out in the MTBI guidelines, that was a recommendation. Okay. So I kind of already talked about this, but often kids are not plugged in to early intervention and special education services, especially those young kids. And what we know about school age kids, so over 5, is that if they don't get identified for special education right after the injury, when they go back to school, it's very unlikely to ever occur. And that's because the injury tends to be forgotten. And that's in spite of the evidence that shows that there are really long-term needs for kids over time. Okay. A couple of reasons why, and these are probably most of you are aware of these, but we do have a hidden disability. So these are, you can't see a brain injury usually. And then injuries are often forgotten over time. So a child maybe is injured at a young age, and then they're doing quite well, but over time, as academic expectations increase, the child will struggle. And at that point, several years post-injury, there isn't a connection made between the injury and how the child's behaving. The other thing that we think happens, we're not exactly sure, but we think that kids are sometimes getting services under different disability labels. And it was really eye-opening for me a few years back. We interviewed state directors of special education and asked them, so these are the people in charge of services for their state, in charge of special education services for their state. And what they reported to us is about 40% of the time, kids with TBI are classified under TBI, but otherwise they get classified under something else. And that, in their opinion, led to probably some less than effective services for those kids. And they felt, the special ed directors felt, that a lot of that had to do with the lack of awareness that educators have. So they weren't asking the right questions. They weren't maybe thinking about the types of assessments that would kind of lead them to more appropriate services for these kids. So that gap really continues. Okay. And the other thing we know, and a number of us have done work in this area, really looking at what does the training look like for folks who are going into school to work with all children, many of whom have had a brain injury. And what we're finding is that at the pre-service level, it's really lacking. It's very rarely covered still to this date in pre-service education. And that, in fact, most educators haven't had this training. What they know about brain injury is what they know from their own experience, from what they have learned through media. And maybe they've gotten interested and done some investigating on their own. And if you look at the next slide, this is just kind of a sample of that. So this was a national sample of 352 teachers, educators. Most of them, 85% of them, said they had worked with a student with TBI. And most of these, about 62%, were special educators with master's degrees. And what they reported was that 75% of them told us they had no training in brain injury. And we saw similar levels of training with school psychologists and speech language pathologists, all of whom were working in schools. Okay, and the last slide is just a little high-level comment that there are some promising practices out there in our country This is more on the radar of school folks across the country, which is a great thing, and good things are starting to happen. So we are seeing the healthcare educational linkages that are so important to these kids. So there are some return to school models in pockets across the country where healthcare and educational settings are linked up. So a great example of that is where you have a consistent form for the types of accommodations that a child would need based on that child's symptoms sent from the physician's office to the school counselor or special ed teacher or someone at the school who's their point person. That's the kind of thing we're starting to see more of. The other is school-based brain injury management teams, and I'm going to point out Oregon, Colorado, Pennsylvania as 3 states that are at the forefront of this. Training consultants, and that is maybe some of you are these consultants on the call, and thank you for your work if you're joining us. These are folks who have received some training in working with students with brain injury, how to help them in the school setting, what kinds of strategies are effective. And these folks are out providing support to their peers and colleagues out in schools who are working with these kids and to their families. That model is one that is being actually evaluated right now through funding with CDC, which is terrific. So we have that team model. We call it the consulting team model. And as it is implemented in both Oregon and Pennsylvania, we have 2 large studies going on right now to look at the impact of those types of models on child behavior, academic performance, and social outcomes. And then the third promising practice, I think, is that there is more professional development in this area. So we are seeing more opportunities and more evidence for providing training to school staff, both in an online, particularly in an online format. There's some emerging evidence, and also just in general that we're seeing more of this, and we're seeing that there can be an effect on teachers feeling more confident and knowing more. And the next step, of course, is to look at the effects of that on child behavior. Okay, so this is where I get to mute myself, and Melissa's going to hop on, Melissa McCart, and she, I think most of you know her, but I will just briefly say who she is. So she works at Siebert alongside our team, and she coordinates and facilitates the Oregon consulting team. That's the team I was just speaking about. She's also involved in a number of our research projects, and most recently has done some fantastic work around legislation. So I'll let you take over, Melissa.
Thanks, Anne. Hi, everyone. I was just noticing as Anne was talking about who you all are on the call, I took a little peek, and we do, in fact, have many of our TBI team members on the call. So thank you all for being here. And we also have some of our liaisons, our regional liaisons on as well. So hello to everybody, and thank you so much. Couple updates that we wanted to talk about. So in Oregon, we've been doing a lot of work around policy and legislation, as Anne said, and currently we have 3 laws, well actually 4, because I didn't put 504 in the slide, but 4 things that can help children access services. So we have our return to play laws, we have our return to school laws, and recently we have done a revision of our credible history, of our eligibility OAR for TBI to include credible history when a medical statement's not available. So I want to just jump into this slide, and you can see I have 1, 2, and 3. Return to play laws were one of the first things that Oregon really addressed. We were the first state, some say second state, but Oregon and Washington went together to create our very first return to play laws in the country. And those are known as Max's and Jenna's laws in Oregon. So at one point we had the return to play laws, we had 504, and we had IDEA. Well, right along with what Anne and Julie both said is we started to identify gaps where kids were just falling through the cracks. And 2 of those places were before they were eligible for a 504. So immediately following injury when they were in the recovery process that still needed support. And like Anne said, kids who have a TBI that has sustained impact, but were not able for some reason to gain special education eligibility under our IDEA and TBI. So in Oregon, we recently tried to address both of those issues. And the first thing, we've been working on this for 5 years actually, was a revision of our eligibility criteria. So this last year, we just got it approved to add a guided credible history interview to our IDEA eligibility criteria when a medical statement cannot be obtained. So we're hoping that creating an alternative way to document TBI for students will increase kids' points of access, so giving them another point of access. And I saw in the questions that Clifford asked about burden of proof for services, pointing out that that was an issue. And yes, exactly, Cliff, that is why we went towards the credible history, is that the burden of proof was pretty substantial. So take, for example, kids who are from another country, don't speak English, never went to a physician. The doctor doesn't know that they can sign this form without liability. Any variety of reasons. That credible history allows another point to prove that something happened. And so that has been added. And in Oregon, that will take effect this coming September. So that's great and exciting news. The other thing we wanted to do is address the gap between initial injury and being eligible for a 504 and an IEP. And we know that to be eligible for an IEP, you have to have sustained impact. Well, typically that looks like 3 to 6 months, right? So a long time before you can get services through IDEA. And 504 in the last revision included more stringent assessment and eligibility criteria for 504. So 504 now takes a little longer than it used to gain access to. So we created a return to learn law. It's House Bill 4140. If anybody would like to look at that, we can share it as well. But House Bill 4140 creates a mandate for our Department of Education to create a form that provides temporary accommodations for students who have TBI immediately following injury. And so it creates an option to fill that gap immediately following injury. We're really excited about that. It goes hand in hand with our return to play laws, and that will take effect August 2021. So we're about a year out from that actually starting, but our Department of Ed is currently in the rules making process. So when a bill passes, the agency that's responsible has the opportunity to create rules, and that's where we're at with that right now. But you should be seeing that rolled out to schools sometime in the next year and a few months. So lots of exciting stuff happening in Oregon, and we currently have plans for the long session to address some other gaps. And one of the things we've learned, and I know Anne was talking a lot about concussion management teams, one of the things we've learned in all these processes is that, yes, concussion management teams are great, and we want them in as many schools as possible, but we have a lot of schools in Oregon, you know, and I focus on Oregon, but that are very, very rural, and they have very small staff and very small numbers of brain injuries and concussions that happen. And so they may not need an entire team to address concussion management, but what they need is a proactive policy, procedure, or plan in place that meets a set number of criteria. And so we're looking at going down a route that will allow all schools to be prepared to address concussion when it happens. So that's what's coming in the future. And I will give this back to Anne at that point.
Yeah, so Julie, if you want to advance. I think we were done pretty much and had to have time for questions and discussion. The last slides are just, I think just that cute little girl. And then our contact information, and Amanda, I think, is planning to send these slides out, so you'll have them. I love this. I could raise my hand if I wanted to. I could raise my hand, I could mute myself. So Amanda, or Melissa, I'm not sure who was asking questions. I did see some there, but actually, can I ask one question first? And I want to ask it of Julie really quick, because I think it would be interesting to the whole group. And Julie, that is, this report to Congress obviously was a 2-year project. It was mandated by Congress. Congress said, please do this report. It has all kinds of great information in it about not just the state of the evidence and some of the gaps in services, but opportunities for action and opportunities for research. And I guess I'm wondering, from a CDC perspective, are there any more plans to do more with this report going forward?
Thanks for asking. And well, we have a couple of projects we've funded to look at this. One is a project on return to school, looking at return to school programs that you are one of the PIs. And that was funded starting last September. And we're looking at programs to see what pathways they're using and how these programs affect children's health and academic outcomes. We also have a project on clinical decision support where we're looking at what's being done in healthcare practices to inform schools and what contributes to children's outcomes. So we have 2 projects that we're currently funding and working on, and we welcome more action in this area. One of my interest in talking about this report still is to get folks knowledgeable about what's in there and how it might help you in your local area in talking to your legislators and people who can affect policies within your local area.
Thanks. So Amanda, do you have any other questions we should be trying to answer?
Looks like we've got a couple in here. Looks like it was during Julie's talk, Cliff said, I'm not sure if you're going to address that youth with TBI are served by Office of People with Developmental Disabilities in some states, and adults like myself are served by the Department of Health. I think the question was, which places are taking care of people with TBI?
That's a great question. So you're asking if it's health departments or offices of disabilities? Is that the question? Make sure I have it right.
Yeah, so addressing that youth with TBI are served by Office of People with Developmental Disabilities in some states, whereas adults are served by the Department of Health.
Oh,
okay.
Yes, thank you. That is true. There is variability, from my understanding, across the country about who's taking care of these people. So states where I've seen the most action have a good broad coalition at the state level that includes the advocacy groups such as Brain Injury Association America, United States Brain Injury Alliance, and the North American Head Injury Administration, NASHIA, along with these departments. And sometimes, like in Georgia, the Department of Health and Aging is one that's covering like a database for all ages, but I know that varies by state. So that's a really good question. And I think one place you could find out about that is to go to NASHIA website, and they have a state-by-state map that links you to the lead brain injury agency in that state, and that would be able to tell you where these actions are happening in a particular state.
Yeah, and
I hope that answers the question.
In Oregon, our APD does some work. Cliff, if you're in Oregon, they might be somebody to look into. It's APD, it's Aging People with Disabilities, which is interesting because they serve a variety of age groups, and they've been heading up some task force, so they might be a resource in Oregon to touch base with.
Okay. And then it looks like Cliff had a follow-up question. If he has further questions, what would be the best place for him to reach out to? So we all have our emails, I believe, at the end of the slides. And looks like Anna's also offering an email address there. And then we have a question from Matt Dawson. I think, Julie, this was also during your part. So it says, is the definition of recovery unclear because recovery occurs in discrete areas such that children who show cognitive improvements might not have motor improvements, etc.? And what do you believe would allow for more objective measures of recovery?
That's a great question. I think one of the issues is there's different aspects of symptoms, as you mentioned. There's physical symptoms, there's somatic symptoms like headaches and sleep disturbances and dizziness, and there's cognitive symptoms. And sometimes children recover, their headaches disappear and they aren't dizzy anymore, but they're having trouble thinking that doesn't show up until they're back in school, or maybe a year later when they have a more complex learning environment. So I think that's what makes recovery tricky, is that there's different kinds of symptoms. Some of them are indivisible. And yes, individual as well. There is more and more coming out about what can affect recovery, such as other health conditions that a child might have, and lack of supportive environments. But I don't think we can honestly say that all children recover within a specific time. So there's more work needed, and I welcome questions of this nature.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Well, I'm looking through and I don't see any other questions right now. If people do have further questions, feel free to email us. We're always happy to answer your questions. You can also go to cbrt.org and see if you'd like to connect with us there.
Yeah, and this is Anne again. I just want to thank everybody for joining us. Really appreciate and respect the work you are all doing. And just want to encourage again for people to get in touch, and we will do our best to answer questions or connect you with someone who can.
Yes, thank you very much for joining today.
Thank you all. All right.